Life can be seen as such a gift when you're staring death in the eyes.
He's probably 6 inches from my face, and then he aimed at my head, emptied out the 3 or 4 more bullets.
Unbelievable tales from everyday people that narrowly escaped their demise.
He said, here's what we're going to do. You're going to pick A or B, and if you pick the right one, you'll live, and if you pick the wrong one, you'll die.
Stories from real-life survivors.
And these sharks are around here, and they circled around the boat that whole day. What's going to happen? Are we going to be alive the next day, or are we going to be fish food?
A podcast on how terrifying life can get.
He repeatedly told me that if I told anybody that he would kill me and my family members.
Listen to the I Survived podcast to hear how tragedy turns into triumph.
There's a point where your mind kind of takes over and you find out you're a lot stronger than you are.
I Survived is available now, wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Today on the prosecutors, our special guest, Gilbert King of Bone Valley. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my prize-winning co-host, Alice.
Brett, I truly thought you were going to end that with my prize-winning co-host, Gilbert King, because that's who we have in the house today. And yes, I sound like I'm underwater, and I continue to be incredibly ill, but no way in the world was I going to miss an opportunity to talk to Gilbert King, producer, co-host of Bone Valley. Gilbert, we are just so thrilled to have you on today. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. I feel like I've been listening to you guys for years, and this is kind of surreal to be in a conversation with you. So thank you for having me.
Well, that's nice of you to say. But, of course, Gilbert is a prize winner, a Pulitzer Prize winner, as a matter of fact, which is pretty impressive. And before we even get into Bone Valley, I do want to hear a little bit about Devil in the Grove, which is your book that won the Pulitzer Prize. Can you let people know a little bit about that before we dive into what we've been talking about for the last few weeks? Leo
Yeah,
Schofield?
absolutely. So this was a case that happened not too far away from Bone Valley, actually, Central Florida. And it's a case of 4 young black men who were wrongfully accused of sexually assaulting a white woman, which is like about the worst thing you can do in the Jim Crow South. And it became this very big case, typically, Jim Crow kind of case where, oh yeah, we know who it is. And they rounded up 4 suspects. But then Thurgood Marshall got involved, and he started the appellate process and started appealing it to the Supreme Court, and got it overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. A new trial was ordered. And then the sheriff took the law into his own hands and decided that he was going to start executing the defendants because he promised his constituency that he was going to deliver justice to these 4 black men. And so when the Supreme Court said their word, he started executing the defendants. And so it's really a deep dive into that case. And I'll tell you what's really kind of terrifying about that was that, the book came out, didn't really do very well at all until it won a prize, and everybody started paying attention to it again. People in Florida like, what? How did we not know about this? And it got some momentum. And ultimately, he was Ron DeSantis at the time, was running for governor. And there was some media pressure. And he actually said while he was on the campaign, if I am elected governor, that's going to be one of the first things I take care of when I get into office. And I remember thinking, wow, that would be surprising. But I think it was like his second day in office. He called a clemency meeting, and he actually pardoned the Groveland 4, and they reopened the case. And so I turned over all my files to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the state attorney, called me into his office, said I needed to see your files. We're going to go through this and vet it. So when you guys said that you were going to take up Bone Valley, that was kind of the same feeling I had. Was like, here are these prosecutors, now they're going to be looking at all my work. And it's terrifying to have somebody actually go in it with a fine tooth comb and really look at everything. And so I made it through that. And ultimately the Groveland Four were exonerated. But so that case is just really, a case 72 years ago that it really was. To me, it's like the power of storytelling. This case was legally dead decades ago, and it just rekindled interest, and people sort of saw what happened through a lot of these files that had been, re-released through a FOIA act. And so it was just a different narrative. So we sort of changed the narrative of what that case was about. And then ever since then, I can never leave Florida. Everyone that comes to me has a new Florida case I got to look into.
And I was going to ask you that. I got to say, you don't sound like you're from Florida.
No.
So can you give us a little bit of your background, how you ended up investigating these cases and doing this work?
Yeah, unrelated. I went to college at the University of South Florida in Tampa, which is like a half hour away from Bone Valley, basically. So I was down there around the same time that this case took place. But that's just purely coincidental. The way I started, really, I started working on a Louisiana death penalty case about this kid named Willie Francis who was sent to the electric chair. The chair didn't kill him. They didn't really know what to do with him. He got all this voltage, but not enough to kill him. And it became a very big Supreme Court case. And so I wrote about it and sort of went back into Cajun, Louisiana, investigated this back in 1946. And while I was looking into that, I saw this letter from Thurgood Marshall kind of advising these young white lawyers how to take this case to the Supreme Court. And I just thought to myself, like, what is Thurgood Marshall doing involved in these death penalty cases? I thought he was like just landmark civil rights cases, first black Supreme Court justice. I had no idea that he was like riding around on trains, taking on these death penalty cases. And so I said, I'm going to look into that when I get back. And when I got back, I went through all his files and I found this Groveland case that was just one of the lawyers from Florida was like, Thurgood, this is the scariest case we've ever been involved in. The Klan is everywhere. They're trying to kill us. They're chasing us out of court. And these guys were terrified. And I remember thinking, what is this? I've never heard of this. And so that's when I started looking into it and realized that nobody had really written about it before.
That's incredible. I mean, truly incredible that you just started digging. And, you said that you turned over your files and your work has truly created, you've moved from just journalism into the world where it affects the storytelling that you're doing. And we're going to get into, of course, Bone Valley and Leo today. But was that your aim when you entered into journalism, to affect change in the real world, or was it just a story tell? And, how do you bridge the gap between those two? Because many people are just journalists or just activists, and they don't bridge the gap as you do.
Wow, I haven't really thought about it that way, but that's a really interesting point. I would say that I started doing this just trying to tell the stories. I came in it through the world of narrative nonfiction writing. I didn't come to it from investigative journalism or newspaper reporting. So the way I came into reporting was, through these narrative nonfiction books that I was writing. And so similar to I guess if you look at David Grann, Killers of the Flower Moon, it's still investigative. There's still an attention to fact and nonfiction, but there's just a different way of telling the stories than I think the way investigative journalists prepare their reports. I've always loved true crime growing up. I mean, I was what I was reading as a kid. I mean, just being fascinated by the Count of Monte Cristo and, Papillon, these stories of wrongful convictions and, adventures. But I was also reading a lot of true crime stuff with my mom, basically. We were big true crime fans. As I started getting older and doing this, my interest became broader. So I really liked the law. I really liked, race and history and criminal justice. And so those are the areas that I wanted to explore and telling these kind of stories. I think what's happened with the Groveland story when it became political and when it became people wanted to do something about this and they were contacting me, how can I help politicians? I sort of recognized that, all right, I have a greater responsibility here. If I was to mislead them and they got into this, I turn over my records and then they're like, hey, you held this back. That shows these guys are guilty. And I'm like, oh, that didn't fit my narrative. What am I going to say to that? And I heard you, Alice, talking about, I guess, bias and your own reputation. If you got exculpatory evidence, potentially exculpatory evidence come across your desk, you're not going to risk that. You're not going to just go forward with that. And Brett, I know you're the same way. This is something that you take really seriously. Just turn it over and take your chances with it, and you can see those little things. I remember one time I was working on Devil in the Grove and I had about 90% of it written. And I'd been trying to get the NAACP files, which are private. They're not something you can do a records request in. And they wouldn't give them to anybody. And I persisted over years, and they finally relented. And they said, okay, you can go down. They're in the Library of Congress. You can go down there and look at those files. We'll give them to you. And I remember getting on the train the next day and realizing, oh man, what if they tell their lawyers in the middle of this thing that they confessed and they need help? My whole story is written. Like, I remember thinking like that was terrifying. But unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. But you can imagine how that would happen. Like, you see something in those files and wow, now my whole story's gone. What do you do then? And so I get to the one thing you learn is like, I don't want to get involved in a story where that could happen to me. I want to be really confident in the cases that I take on.
I mean, I'm sure most of the people who are listening to this have listened to Bone Valley, but for those who haven't, how did you get involved in Leo Schofield's case?
Yeah. And this is an interesting story because we sort of start the podcast out with this story because it is unique, but I do a lot of book talks. I get invited to state attorneys' offices, judicial conferences. This was a judicial conference in 2018. I was still out really doing a book tour. And so they invited me to talk about my last book. When I got done, I was signing books and one of these judges came up to me. It was all judges. And some of them were pitching stories about cases that they worked on that they wanted, hey, you should write about. But then this one guy hands me a business card, Scott Cupp. And it just said, Leo Schofield, his prison number. It said, not just wrongfully convicted, he's an innocent man. And I remember, what the hell is this? I went out to dinner with some public defenders that night. I said, hey, what do you make of this? This judge handed me this. And they all passed it around. They said, this guy's a sitting judge? They're not supposed to do this. That's, there's...
Wait, Gilbert, he didn't preface it? He just passed you this card?
He just passed me a card and kind of motioned to call him. And I'm like, that night, I'm like, what is this? First of all, I'm really skeptical of everything. Even a judge, to me, it's like, it's still Florida, like anything could be wacky, you know what I mean? And so I was like trying to get some opinions on this. And these public defenders are like, wow, I'm really surprised the judge gave you that. And it came to the last guy, and he was from Polk County where this case took place. And he said, I know this case. You should call him. And that was the thing that sort of perked me up. Like, all right, this is not some crackpot judge. I didn't think he was anyway. But, it kind of made me think definitely worth a call. And so that's how it started. I got back to New York, and I talked to him, and he was trying to tell me about the case. And I frankly remember saying, like, look, I'm in the middle of a book. It's going to take me a couple of years, but I'm really interested in this case. And I could feel he's like, no, it can't be years. Like this is immediate. This guy's been in prison for 30 something years. And he sort of said, do me a favor, just read the trial transcript. And I remember I sort of agreed to get him off the phone because you're trying to I recognize he was kind of, he was really advocating for Leo. And so I said, all right, send me the transcript. I'll definitely take a look. And I did. And, I had questions. I'd come back to him and say, I don't understand this and I understand that. And I'd talk to some other friends who consult with me. And, the case seemed really interesting. One of the things I thought, though, was that the case really doesn't become spectacularly interesting until it kind of changes on its head 17 years later when you have this potentially new evidence that is revealed. We'll talk about that, I'm sure. But, up until that point, I hate to even say this, but it kind of felt like a routine wrongful conviction. Like, oh, this could have went either way. I don't know. Definitely make a case for it. I could definitely tell that the prosecutor, John Aguero, was a much more persuasive and effective lawyer in this trial. And I could see, even though sometimes when you're reading these things, you don't see the case in court, you can still kind of feel the emotion of it and feel how someone's power exists, in the entire trial. And I definitely got that sense. But still, ultimately, it seemed to be, there's some witnesses who may or may not be mistaken. It didn't really get really interesting until 15, 20 years later when you get this revelation about this new evidence. So that, once I started asking questions about that and looking into that, that's when I started to really be interested in pursuing this case. At that point, I think I was pretty convinced that Leo was innocent and that Jeremy Scott was the one who's responsible.
So then you no longer had the couple years, I'll work on it. Did you,
No.
did you rearrange your schedule? How did you do that?
Honestly, there was a time in 2019 where I knew I had a writing fellowship at the New York Public Library. I already committed to that. It's like a 9-month fellowship, and it's a really great, prestigious fellowship at the Coleman Center. And I knew I had to be back at that at September. So I thought the only way I can really look into this case, and I originally thought out that I was going to start out writing a long form article. That's what I was thinking. I listened to podcasts, but it was not on my radar. And so I thought, I'll do a long feature, maybe for something like the Marshall Project, and just do a long story about Leo's case. But I knew that I would have to be back in New York in September. So I had like 4 months to really investigate. So I said, I'm just going to go down there and basically move down there and just investigate this thing. And I had just hired a research assistant to help me with my book, Kelsey Decker. She was the one, it was her idea that basically said, I said, Kelsey, I got a couple things going on here. I got to finish this book. And then there's this case that just came in about Leo Schofield. And she was like, well, that guy's still in prison. That's the one we should do. Let's pivot to that. And I thought, oh, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Like, this guy needs it more than the other one's history. I can come back to that later. So that's what I did. I just decided to put my book on hold. I'm embarrassed to admit that it's 5 years later and I still have not written that book, but I plan to get to that at some point.
It's marinating this whole time.
It is. It's just getting better in my head, right?
There you go. It's just getting better with time. It's aging like a fine wine.
Exactly.
Really quick on Kelsey. She also did a phenomenal job on Bone Valley. So that's incredible. I was going to ask you how you decided to go the podcast route. And this is your first podcast. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So, you've done storytelling in multiple mediums in different ways. How did you find the podcast world's ability to either reach a different audience, same audience, or move people in a way that may have been similar or dissimilar to your long form writing?
Yeah. It's really interesting because I can tell you that, usually I'm doing these old cases from the 40s and 50s and like everybody's dead. So I'm just looking at documents. I'm not hearing voices at all. And it's a little bit dry. You can still create scenes with dialogue from accounts and testimony, but it's not quite the same. And I recognize we went in to see Leo a couple times. It might've been the first time we came out of there. He was such a good storyteller. He's got that, New England accent, which kind of is like, that's Florida in a nutshell. You're getting all sorts of accents. People are from everywhere, and the Deep South included. And so there's something very Florida about this New England guy stuck down in Florida. But he was a really good storyteller. And I just remember thinking like, wow, this is really powerful, like his words. And it just sort of sprung from that. I think it was Kelsey's idea too. I think she said that we should do a podcast instead of just working on this long form. And she'd been much more familiar with podcasting, not as a worker, but as someone who listened to them. And so I was on board. I'd listened to a few and I said, these are really powerful. And I think, maybe it's a different audience, but there's something immediate about it that I really, really love. And I have to say, like, as a writer who's used to just writing out quotes, to hear the voices, to hear people's voices crack, like those are moments that you sort of, they're more emotional than anything you can read in a book. When you can hear somebody struggling with something, and obviously like Jeremy Scott was the perfect example of that. So just listen to him talk about torment and this overwhelming blanket that's been hanging over him for all these years. You can feel it in the way he speaks. And I think you can hear it in the desperation, listening to Leo's wife, Chrissy, talking about another defeat in court. Those words I think would be poignant on the page, but when you hear them and you hear these voices cracking, you can sense the urgency. And there's just something really powerful about that.
Let me ask you this, going back to something you said earlier. One of the ways we described Bone Valley is it has an agenda. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I just think you went in convinced, didn't go in, but at some point when you decided to do this podcast, by the time you decided to do the podcast, you were convinced Leo was innocent. And you wanted to convince other people that Leo was innocent. And you wanted to do it by presenting the evidence that you thought was compelling. How do you balance wanting to do that with, there's always going to be stuff on the other side of the ledger. There's always going to be stuff that makes the person you think is innocent look guilty. That's, probably wouldn't be in prison otherwise. How do you balance sort of wanting to push that agenda with ensuring that you're not leaving out the stuff that might be negative for the subject of your work?
Yeah, and that's a really important question. And it's something we talked about a lot in this case, particularly when you're talking about the very beginning of the state's case, where they start with this, bad character evidence that they just present. I think it was 21 witnesses straight, and not all of them testified about domestic violence. Half of them, I think, just testified about his temper, punching walls and all that stuff. And, as what should have happened in that case was that the state attorney should have filed what's called a letter of intent in Florida saying, I plan on presenting this kind of case involving that 404 evidence. And then there's a negotiation. You guys described this really well in the podcast, better than I'm doing right now. But usually the defense will come in and say, that's a bit overkill. That's risking something. Can we just narrow it down to maybe 3 witnesses who talk about domestic violence and maybe 1 about the temper, and they come to some kind of agreement by that. But that never happened in Leo's case. Jack Edmond did not object to any of this. There was no letter of intent. So those first 21 witnesses really defined the trial. I think it really sunk Leo. I think I've had judges and prosecutors, people that I consult with, and who all said the same thing that you guys said, like the trial was basically over at that point. You could not like Leo hearing all of that. And so what we try to do is sort of present the state's case. One of the things, we didn't want to get involved in, and this you could see it once you start down this road, what was going to happen. I talked earlier about this case doesn't really become something that really interested me until it gets to a post-conviction relief stage. That's where the case that was the question we were trying to get to. Why is Leo Schofield still in prison when we have a known killer who lives in the same neighborhood, who's forensically connected to the crime scene, and he's confessed multiple times? That to us seemed to be about, but we had to also cover the state's case. I think one of the things that comes up in Leo's case is this domestic violence, and it is hammered on by the state. And so we felt like we have to do an investigation in this. And we did an investigation. We talked to a lot of people who didn't make it into the podcast, some of the closest people to Michelle, the victim in this case. And what we were finding in the investigation was that there is the potential now to pit family member against family member with their recollections of this. We were also finding that sort of what you pointed out in some of the police statements that people gave were slightly different than what we were seeing as the trial testimony. And when we started looking into a lot of this stuff, we were just finding more and more information that sort of disputed it. And I honestly just made the call that I think it's distasteful to not only pit family members against family members, but to also disrespect the victim in this case by doing this he said, she said argument. I think there's probably nobody more disappointed in the fact that we didn't go into that in detail as we should than Leo, because I think Leo was trying to tell us all along, some of this stuff just did not happen. At one point, the prosecution brings a witness in who says that Leo got so angry one time, he started stabbing his leg and was bleeding everywhere. And Leo describes this. He said, I told Jack Edmond, let me pull my pants down in front of the jury. There are no scars on my leg. That did not happen. I don't know what is happening here. We started looking at, there was one particular incident involving a headbutt that apparently knocked Michelle out cold. They thought she was dead or something like that. But we got the first responder, the ambulance, but it has nothing to do with anything that's described in the trial. They came and they're actually treating Leo for something. Michelle was fine. And so how do you reconcile that? So ultimately, we came down to believe, after all this research and work that we did, was that we thought it was entirely possible that the prosecutor, John Aguero, who was kind of manipulating some of the testimony with his major witnesses, including Alice Scott and the LaFoons, it's very possible that he was also doing this with some of the bad character witnesses. And I tracked down one woman who's mentioned in the trial just to ask her what it was like talking to John Aguero when he was trying to get her to be a witness against Leo. And she said, all I can tell you is he had a temper, but I never saw him do one thing bad. And she said he put so much pressure on him, saying, you don't understand, her blood, Michelle's blood was all over that trailer. He slit her throat from ear to ear and came this close to decapitating her. And these were the kind of things that he was saying to witnesses. And so a lot of it wasn't panning out the way the state presented. So that was one of the things I think that really reflected it. We just did not want to spend multiple episodes doing a he said, she said about domestic violence when really Leo was on trial for his life for murder.
And I'm really glad you've had the opportunity to kind of explain that because, our two podcasts do two different things, right? We were covering kind of the historical, what has happened in this case and looking at the trial records and covering those 21 witnesses and all of that. What is not objected to, we can't go and put something in the record that's not there. But I think that's really helpful for listeners to hear the process in which you do your investigative part of your journalism. And you also have to make kind of moral choices in terms of how these podcasts and what goes into these podcast will affect real people's lives, because this is not a historical case from the 1940s. People are still alive. Leo is still in jail. Michelle still has family who are alive and love her and miss her. And spending time on that wasn't, necessary for the storytelling that needed to happen, which is this thing that never happens. We always say everyone wants to point to must be a serial killer in the area, but there's never any evidence of it. And here you have kind of a 1 in a million type of case where that did happen. And that is a story worth telling. And before we move on from this, because there's so much substance I'd love to ask you about, I held off on listening to your latest episode. You had an update episode with Leo, I think, as he's preparing to hopefully finally be granted parole. And I had held off on listening to that while we were recording, just to not be affected, by anything. And kind of, I listened to it after we finished recording all 8 episodes. And one thing that I had a lot of kind of turmoil over in our last episode was pointing out the fault that Leo held, despite the fact that I believe he's innocent, right? And we talked about this at the very end, where his actions before Michelle died basically it helped convict him in a lot of ways because of those 21 witnesses, whether they were true or not. And I felt a lot of turmoil with that, because it's difficult to paint humans as these complex characters. If someone's been wronged in such a massive way, serving, 35 plus years in prison for a crime you did not commit, being called your wife's murderer when you did not do that. I mean, those are just things that can never be erased. Those are hard enough, but humans are not black and white. And so when I listened to your last update episode and I heard Leo say those exact words, that he'd been doing so much introspection, and how when he went to this new center, one of the things they were supposed to do is admit to their crime, right? Yeah. Say, I murdered my wife. And he was like, I can't do that. I can do everything else, but I cannot tell a lie. And his own introspection into not just playing the victim, but recognizing his own actions before Michelle was killed. And the kind of person he was then is not who he wanted to be and not who he is now. And it was such a full circle for me to hear his own words say that, because I didn't hear him say that before we recorded the episode, and there's no way he heard us say that, of course, because this was recorded back in December, or it was released in December. So I just want to note that your choices to essentially have humanity towards the people still involved in this case is noted, and something that every journalist has to decide. But also, it wasn't lost on Leo, which for me was very, very meaningful.
Have you ever wondered why laundry detergent comes in these massive plastic jugs? They're heavy, messy, and hard to store. Worst of all, 91% of plastic doesn't get recycled, leaving laundry jugs to sit in landfills for centuries to come. I wanted to ditch the jug, and fortunately, I found a solution. Earth Breeze. I absolutely love my eco sheets. Imagine for a moment something that looks like a dryer sheet, but it actually replaces that cup of goo, a pre-measured liquidless laundry detergent sheet that dissolves in every wash cycle, hot or cold. No measuring, no mess, and no heavy lifting. That's right, no plastic jug. Earth Breeze is my favorite detergent now. There's no plastic jug, and it's so much easier to use. The packaging is a cardboard envelope that saves so much space. I can fit 720 loads of sheets where I used to fit just 1 load of detergent jug. And guys, I'm really not just saying this. I've been using it every day. I run my laundry about 7 days a week with 3 kids. I used it this morning when my kids had an accident. We needed to get sheets dry and clean right away. I used Earth Breeze.
Yeah, well, Earth Breeze is one of those sponsors that I talk about with everyone I know, because it's not just easy, it also works. You will still get a powerful clean. Earth Breeze is tough on stains, fights odors, and your clothes will come out clean every time. Join over 2 million Americans making a difference with Earth Breeze. And if you're not convinced, they offer a 100% satisfaction guarantee. If you don't like it, you'll get a full refund. No questions asked and no return necessary. Trust me, there is no reason not to switch. Right now, our listeners can subscribe to Earth Breeze and save 40%. Go to earthbreeze.com/prosecutors to get started. That's earthbreeze.com/prosecutors for 40% off. earthbreeze.com/prosecutors. Are you having trouble sleeping or staying asleep? Is poor sleep negatively impacting your life? Have you tried other sleep supplements with no success? Sleep is the foundation of our mental and physical health. When you're sleeping well, you can perform at your best, mentally and physically. Proper sleep can also increase focus, boost energy, and improve your mood. And that's where Beam's Dream Powder comes in. It is a science-backed, healthy hot cocoa for sleep. If you know me, you know that Dream has been a game changer for my sleep. I'm about to get ready to go to bed, and I'm thinking I'm going to make myself a cup tonight. I've been working a lot, and I need to get my sleep. I cannot lay around in bed waiting to go to sleep. And our listeners can get a special discount on Beam's Dream Powder. Their science-backed, healthy hot cocoa for sleep with no added sugar. Better sleep has never tasted better, and it's now available in delicious flavors like chocolate peanut butter, cinnamon cocoa, and sea salt caramel. With only 15 calories and 0 grams of sugar, you are going to get a good night's sleep, and you're going to enjoy it while you do.
And the numbers don't lie. In a clinical study, 93% of participants reported Dream helped them get better sleep. Beam Dream is easy to add to your nighttime routine. Just mix Dream into hot water or milk, froth, and enjoy before bed. Find out why Forbes and New York Times are all talking about Beam and why it's trusted by the world's top athletes and business professionals. If you want to try Beam's best-selling Dream Powder, get up to 40% off for a limited time when you go to shopbeam.com/prosecutors and use code prosecutors at checkout. That's shopbeam.com/prosecutors and use code prosecutors for up to 40% off.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And, that's one of the things I think was really sincere. Like when he talks about that, he specifically says, I had to acknowledge that there was a reason that people convicted me is because of my past. And that was a big part of my story. And so instead of taking accountability for the murder, which he says I can never do, I can take accountability for my past. And it's one of those things like you hit the nail on the head. Leo's a totally different person now. Obviously he's in his mid 50s now. I'm not interviewing the 20-year-old Leo. He's a totally different person. And so that probably plays a big part because everything I'm hearing from Leo is definitely more mature. I'm not seeing him punch a wall in the middle of my interviews or any of that kind of stuff. And so that was, something that we considered. But I was surprised to hear him actually say that because I was wondering how he was going to do that because they really do expect everybody to come in and take accountability. And, obviously 99% of people come in that program are guilty and are admitting their guilt. They've pled guilty or they're admitting their guilt now in order to get through this process. So it's unusual in this program to have someone who's maintaining their innocence. And we were very curious how Leo was going to do that and take this accountability. And I think you heard pretty much what he's probably been saying in those workshops.
One thing that I really appreciated that you did, there are, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on the number of siblings, but there are 2 brothers that stand out for Michelle. There's her younger brother or the younger brother. And I think, if I remember correctly, he either spoke or wrote a letter in support of Leo and now thinks he probably was wrongly convicted.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people would have just focused on him. And obviously you guys talked to him and you do focus on him more. But I really appreciated that in that episode about the parole hearing, you played the letter being read from the other brother, the older brother, who still thinks Leo's guilty. And I thought that was a really sort of honest thing to do because it would have been very easy for you not to do that, but you did it anyway. And I thought that was a testament to, as I said, you do have something you're trying to accomplish here, but it's not as if you just hid all the bad facts for Leo, or that's not even a fact. It's just sort of an opinion of one family member who still thinks he's guilty.
Yeah, and that was, we didn't really understand who was going to be calling in or anything like that. And I had reached out to the older brother a couple times, but he lives in California. It was really hard to reach him, and he didn't really have any interest in doing this. But, he did call in as a member of that, for the parole hearing. And I just thought the best thing we can do is just let him have his say and don't comment on it. We were all just we've grown really close to Jesse, the other brother, who had sort of been very gracious with his time and very helpful to us and talking about these awful, painful moments of his life and going back into that. And, even though Michelle's father, David, didn't want to talk to us either, always in the back of our minds, we just don't want to hurt them and do anything more to damage them. And that was our biggest concern. And so I felt like, the case, I felt like it's so confident that it's also very complicated. People can have two sides of the story. And, I think, when Jesse says, hey, when the guys in the suits show up and tell you what happened, you're definitely want to believe them. And I think that is the case. He was kind of too young, so he didn't have those conversations. He didn't learn about this until much later and started to believe that, Leo was wrongfully convicted. But, thank you for saying that. It really, that stuff never ends with us. We're always aware of that. And we've always tried to maintain those relationships with Michelle's friends and family members and just try to explain what we're doing and give them the opportunity to talk to us if they want or not.
So I knew that you were listening to us as we were recording, and I can't tell you how nervous I was. It didn't change what we had to say, but just because I really respected the work that you did in Bone Valley. In fact, I recommended your podcast well before we started recording. When someone asked, I think,
so nice.
What was a podcast that, you loved last year? And I said it was yours. But now's your chance. You heard our theories. Not the people listening today will have had access to the latest episodes, but obviously the live feed hasn't had all of them. You heard our theories, and I would love to hear way more than we do, because we never talked to any of the witnesses in this case. We read, cold hard records, which is very different than speaking to people. And tell us what we got wrong.
You didn't get anything wrong. I can't find a single thing. I mean, even Brett said you did some correction about the Linda Sells thing, but you were so close. I just thought you're going to come back when you do the timeline and correct that. So it didn't feel like a mistake to me. I didn't see anything wrong. In fact, the opposite's kind of true. I picked up things that you were talking about that I had not noticed or had slipped through me. And I'm going to admit to something that no one will ever admit to, but I believe I had some tunnel vision myself in certain areas of this case. One of the areas was, at one point, I just realized that everything on the timeline that Alice Scott was talking about just didn't lead anywhere. It never got you closer to Leo. That's what I felt. And so when I started learning about more and more about some of the things that she was saying and trying to fit that in the timeline, I kind of blocked out a little bit and just said, all right, that's not getting me closer to where this case needs to be. And you guys brought up something, I don't remember which episode it was, but you guys brought this up, and it was about the timeline about when Leo and his father left Vince Raynor's house to go look for Michelle, and how they would have had to find Michelle really fast for the timeline to work, for Leo to show up in the Mazda with Michelle and be seen by Alice Scott. And the point you guys made was something I never considered. Like, if they're out there looking for Michelle and suddenly they find her, of course, Leo's father is going to go back to Vince Raynor's house and say, oh, we got her. Everything's all right. Because for all they know, the police are out there looking, and they're not going to do that. But that's not what happened. And so when you brought that up, I was like, oh, that's another one of those things. And this is one of the things that comes up a lot in this case. Whenever there's something new, like that's revealed to me, whether it's from you guys or something that I learned, it never really points to Leo. It always points away from Leo. And that just was happening over and over again, where you find something new and you go, oh, and that doesn't help the state at all. And those are the kind of things that were happening over and over. So there was a couple instances where you guys were talking about I wouldn't say they're minor details, they're really important details about the timeline that you guys went far beyond what I would have done. And I was just learning from it as you go. Another thing, and this is another thing that came up, and I actually talked to Leo about this the other day, because he asked me about it. And I said, I think it was Alice, I think it was you that brought something up about Leo's demeanor being very consistent before the time that the state said Michelle was dead and afterwards. And that really resonated with me when you said it. And I didn't really think about it before, because clearly he was upset and searching and trying to find Michelle. And then obviously at some point the state thinks he's killed her, but he's still out there really concerned, driving around, approaching policemen in parking lots to talk about his missing wife. Obviously shows up just minutes after he would have supposedly killed Michelle, shows up at Michelle's father's house to have a conversation. I mean, those are the kind of things that you were describing that I really hadn't really thought about. So they were details that came to me just listening to you go over the evidence and talk about your experience with witnesses. So it was really the reverse of what you're saying. I didn't get anything wrong. The thing that you got really interesting, and I don't know if we want to get into it now, but your closing arguments, I was just absolutely riveted. I listened to that a couple times. Do you guys want to talk about that, or should I just keep going? I'd rather hear from
I
you.
think everyone wants to talk about the flex plate.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll just give you some background on that. So the way that happened to us, it was really late in the stage. It was right when we started corresponding with Jeremy. And, Jeremy basically saying, I want to tell the story, the whole story, but I don't know how to do it, and so we said, we'll help you with that. We want to hear everything. And so he was locked up in solitary confinement, basically. So he couldn't have an interview with us. And so I just started asking him questions, do you mind talking about this? These are things I had studied all his interrogations and everything. I just wanted to get him to go through it in detail. And he wrote a letter, and he started mentioning some details that he'd never mentioned before. One of them was Michelle panicked and started to drive away, and he reached over through the car and parked, and the car stopped, and that's when he lost it, he says. To me, it's like, we never got an explanation for why that car was broken down. Like I saw what happened to it, but I don't know why that happened. A cracked flywheel. That's what it said in the report. And so that was just something I thought in the head, like maybe that is what screwed up the car. I'm a New York guy. I don't know anything about cars. So like I did what we did, found an expert, a Mazda guy, a classic Mazda guy who walked us through it. And he said pretty much exactly what you guys said, talking about that flex plate. It's not the flywheel, it's the flex plate. And it's really hard to crack a flex plate. It would have to be something to do it. And I'm sitting there listening to this, but then listening to you is exactly what you guys were saying. And so that was really, really powerful to me. But there was one thing I wanted to show you because, I don't know if this happens in a lot of true crime podcasts, but for me, it's like when we learn something new, a lot of times the best resource we could go to was Leo himself. And so when we got that letter from Jeremy saying, that he threw the car in the park, I said, let me ask you something about how that car runs. And Leo wrote me this letter back, and I just want you to read it, just to hear it so that you can tell. This is from July of 2021. And right after I told him about what Jeremy said about throwing the car in park. Hi, Gilbert. I wish you could feel the intensity of my energy when you ask questions like the one about the flywheel. Let me say this much here. I learned about the flywheel being damaged from the FDLE crime report, probably the same one you were referring to. That little fact is another thing that was totally ignored all those years ago. Simply put, no one seemed to care about details like that. The Mazda was nearly perfect. There was nothing wrong with it before Jeremy did what he did. And for years, the flywheel was a mystery, even to me. I know quite a bit about car mechanics, having learned much from my father. I knew even back then that there were only so many ways a flywheel can be cracked. So with no details, I was left to try and fill in the blanks. But the flywheel didn't allow for much. When I learned through your investigation what Jeremy actually did with the car, i.e. slamming into park while Michelle tried to drive out of that area, that piece of the story became fact for me. That's exactly how to damage a flywheel. And he says, it's almost the only way to do that kind of damage. And then he says, now here's my question. How does Jeremy know to even say such a thing if he didn't commit the murder? Likewise, the $10 she had left after getting $3 worth of gas out of her $13 in tips she made that day. Coming from Jeremy, I'd say those are pretty significant details that are hard to sweep under a rug. Here's another question. Would the state ignore all this from him if I did not exist? Would they say he was lying and refuse to charge him even though his confession aligns with known evidence? What prosecutor would like to go on record and make that claim? And if such a prosecutor would admit that they would charge him, well, I've raised my reasonable doubt according to the law. This case is pathetically sad all the way around and beyond frustrating all these years. Thank you, Gilbert. I look forward to seeing you, Leo. So Leo was onto this too way back then. And I'm almost ashamed to admit the reason we couldn't get into it is we had these kind of two conflicting reports from these two mechanics. I personally believe the one that you and Leo went with. I believe that Jeremy had something to do with making that car no longer run correctly. The problem with it, and we ran into this a lot about things to keep in the podcast and things to keep out. There's a lot of stuff I think that would have helped Leo if we'd have left it in, this being one of them. But we didn't learn about it until very late in our investigation. And we'd already kind of formed the way the episodes were going. And to sort of take that segue from the discovery of what Jeremy's telling us, knowing that the next episode is going to meet Jeremy, to do a segue on the flywheel flex plate would have taken people out of that. So our thinking was, let's go back and do a bonus episode on that. It's not a way to work it in. We can't really do it from a storytelling perspective. And so to listen to you focus in on that. It felt like now we don't have to do the bonus episode because you guys really nailed that.
So I'll let Brett talk because he is our flex plate man now. He wasn't before, so we've never heard that letter before. That's brand new information.
Yeah,
to
it's
us.
all new. No, I've never read it.
And that blows my mind that he was onto this back in 2021. And I wanted to commend you. I think I said it in our episode, but I probably did it inarticulately because that was a very emotional episode. Correct me if I'm wrong, but for your interview of Jeremy Scott, we wouldn't know about the slamming the car from drive into park, right? I don't think I saw that in any other report. It was from your podcast. And I remember it kind of stuck out when I heard that, and that was it. So if you had not asked him that question and he hadn't answered, I think a lot of evidence was already pointing towards Jeremy, but that one to me was just such a linchpin because there was no reason for, Leo to do that to his own car.
Right. I mean, that one really jumped out at us too, because he had not mentioned that at any time. And part of the reason was, I think usually when Jeremy's interviewed, it's sort of he's being questioned in court, or even when it's Leo's attorneys calling him, he becomes a hostile witness. So it's a lot of those, yes sir, no sir questions. And then, the state is very antagonistic and, they're really attacking him. He never really has the chance to just talk about his story, to just sit down and really just talk about how he's feeling. And I credit Kelsey a lot with that, because Kelsey was very focused on the kind of questions that you might get in a therapy session, like, how did that make you feel? What were you thinking? Those kind of things. And I don't think he's been questioned that way before. And I could see him, I was sitting across from him, and he was like looking at Kelsey and answering those questions. And I think it was just a different way of talking that kind of relaxed him, and it enabled him to go a little deeper and recall some details that maybe he didn't want to ever talk about before. I mean, he's always kind of clammed up when he gets to the parts about the stabbings or even the other murders that he's committed. He doesn't really take you into the murders. He takes you right up into them. And if you'll notice, I mean, I do notice these things. I get obsessed with this stuff, but he's always, when he's describing this, he says, I was just going to rob her. The knife fell out. When he talks about the cab driver, I don't know if this was in the podcast, but he said it's kind of like a hair trigger. It just kind of went off. Yeah, you shot him 3 times though. He definitely doesn't want to see that side of himself revealed in this, but he does. The details around that are always really accurate. And when we talk to him about the other murders that he's committed and confessed to, it's the same thing. And a lot of this is not in the podcast, but he can describe things right up until and right afterwards in total clarity. And they're details that, they're important details, a lot like slamming that car into park, where that really does kind of explain how that car could have broken down like that.
Yeah, and we talk about this all the time because you always have statements in these cases from people who do lie and have reasons to lie. And I think there are some people, when they catch somebody in a lie, or they see a lie, or they see a change, they just, well, then I don't believe anything they say. Yeah. And that's, to me, not the way to look at it. People say the devil is in the details, but so is the truth. And when you see details like that no one would think to make up or have a reason to make up. No one would think to feed to him. Little things like that. Like, him smoking cigarettes afterwards and their cigarettes found, or the $10, or the explaining how the car is damaged when nobody's really even thinking about that. Just those kind of little details tell me that, was he lying at times? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Was he lying even in the final statement? I think 100%, because as I said, I think he did have a real motive for taking her there, and it wasn't an accident. And when you see all that, to me, I think he is incredibly believable. Whether you'll ever know the entire truth or not, the critical, most important things, the sort of basic story that he's telling, I think it's 100% true. And I think you can see that, and particularly when you guys spoke to him, like Alice was saying, the story that came out was much more natural. It wasn't antagonistic. It wasn't in a cross-examination or a hostile witness type situation. I mean, that was a disaster.
Yeah.
That hearing was just a complete disaster, and you can see why it went the way it went. One other thing I wanted to say, and I mentioned this at the beginning when we were doing the podcast, that we were researching and you reached out in the middle, and it was funny. And I'm just curious what you were thinking in this whole period, because, we would talk to you. We saw you at CrimeCon, and I would say, yeah, we're still looking into it. Not sure. Don't know yet. Don't know how we're going to go. And you'd be like, oh, that's fine. That's fine. And then I would send you an email and I'd be like, hey, is this a manual or an automatic transmission? And I wouldn't even tell you why. I would never give you a reason like why I was asking you these questions. Do you have the autopsy report? And you would just send it. You wouldn't ask me why I wanted it or anything. And I was constantly impressed by that. And the whole time I'm like, man, it's gonna suck when we come out and say he did it. We're gonna have like this whole issue. But then, when we get to the end, and obviously things worked out. But I'm just curious, as this whole process was unfolding, what were you thinking as we were sort of getting ready to do this?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, and it's a testament to you and my having listened to you all the time, is that I knew how careful you were. And I wouldn't be confident handing this over to anybody. I really would not be confident, but I've listened to your show enough. I'll give you an example, like what you just mentioned about Jeremy, telling the truth sometimes, not telling the truth. It's very lazy and easy to just say, well, he lied that time, he's not credible, throw it out. I mean, maybe that's a threshold in that holds true in court, but I'm doing something totally different with the storytelling of the case. So to me, it's kind of like the way you look at when you look at the Adnan Syed case, you look at Jay Wilds. I mean, clearly not always truthful, but can you look at the reasons why he might not be truthful at times and separate those from the things that he's saying that are really pretty powerful? And so that's the way I wanted. I was hoping somebody would have the discipline and the legal training to go in and look at this stuff with a little more thought than I think some people would do this. So when you guys, I mean, to me, it's like, I've been listening to your show for years now, and I love the detail that you get into, because I don't think there's a lot of podcasts that can go into that kind of depth and speak from experience from a prosecutor's side. I was just excited that you would do it. I was very confident in this case. I have consultants that I look at all the time, and they're not just like the Innocence Project people. I have like friends who are judges and prosecutors, and I want to look and hear how they think about this stuff. So when I found out you guys were going to look into this, I knew your reputation, and I knew how thorough you are and thoughtful. And I had no problem with it. I was excited about it.
By the way, that's such journalistic integrity right there, right? Like, you just have to let it go. But thank you for sharing so much of the resources that you worked very hard to gather. You made our job a lot easier by sharing those. I mean, you really didn't share your thoughts at all, right? You were not trying to sway us at all, which I couldn't believe it, because I would be micromanaging all the time. I'd be like, how are you going to come out? Really, just give me a hint. I just need to know if I need to take some medication to deal with the stress or not. And
I was stressed. I'll give you some. I was stressed because I also knew that you guys were really sharp, and I knew you were going to find stuff that I didn't see, and that terrified me. So
wow, no. So thank you for allowing us to cover this case and to be so generous with all of the, firsthand things. Now, one area that we may have disagreed on, that we thought that likely we would have voted to convict at the original trial before everything we found out about Jeremy Scott later on. And, the things that were really problematic at trial, other than those 21 witnesses about his character, the LaFoon's testimony and Alice Scott. And I know you kind of described having a little bit of tunnel vision of wanting to just dismiss Alice Scott, but those witnesses, and really Alice Scott, did you do much work into kind of figuring out what was going on there? She really was, I think, a huge reason that he was convicted. She put the timeline there. Obviously, her story changed, but Jack Edmond really did not do as much of tearing her down in cross-examination as he could have done with some research. So I'm curious to hear about your thoughts on Alice Scott, and then kind of tangentially the LaFoons, who I think were influenced by Alice Scott.
Yeah, those are the witnesses, I think, when I got to reading the transcript for the first time, that I really paid attention to. And one of the things I found like really disturbing from this case was that the way Linda Sells was handled in this case, she was allowed to get up there. She was called by the state, and she was allowed to tell a story without a particular date. She just told the story about seeing Leo come out carrying something heavy, and she's just described it as one particular evening. And the prosecutor, John Aguero, never tried to pin her down on that. He just let that story take place. And when you see he gets to his closing argument, because Jack Edmond did try to make a point of saying, no, she saw that a week or two earlier. That wasn't that. When John Aguero gets to the closing argument, he does something really clever, and I admire him. He was a really powerful prosecutor. He said, look, let's not argue about a few minutes or a few days here and there. She saw it. And that's how he just sort of put it to bed. Like, she saw it. Doesn't matter what day she saw it. She saw it. And to me, it's like, I thought, like, this guy also in his closing, he kind of disparages Jack Edmond. He says, you probably heard a lot of names you never heard before. That's because Jack Edmond doesn't have the right names. He's not the person that knows all the evidence and knows the names. I do. I'm familiar with every single witness and every single piece of evidence in this case. And he kind of puts Jack Edmond in a box there by saying he's not reliable. And so it enables him to tell the story of, like, I'm the credible one. And so I don't disagree with that. I think everybody I showed this to said Leo should have been convicted before this defense even had a chance to bring their case up. And I believe that's true. I understand exactly why the jury did it, even if from an intellectual reason from reading the transcript. I think, Brett, you mentioned this.
The jury of 10, by the way.
Yeah, the jury of 10, right? You mentioned this about the jury. Like, if you're listening to this, you would have absolutely convicted him. And that's what the jury did for the most part, except for that one juror. Everybody else there had no qualms about this. I think they felt so confident about it that they were able to give a break to him and not sentence him or not recommend a death sentence. I think they believed that he was guilty, and that was not they didn't feel guilty about that at all. So, yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think that's part of the reason. I think when I look at this, the first half of this case about Leo's conviction, I don't think I would have done a podcast about that. It's not that interesting, and it's not that unusual for something like this to happen. And I just want to give one more credit to what you guys did, which I thought was phenomenal. When you do your closing arguments or your theories of the case, there was always something that really bugged me about how John Aguero was really an expert with circumstantial cases and tying them all together in his storytelling. And you talk about this as being a storytelling case. And one of the things John Aguero does really effectively is, I think the journalist called it the 12 days of Christmas closing. And so it's basically like, if you want to believe Leo's innocent, you have to believe that his next door neighbor who just happened to see him carry a body out on the night she disappeared. And he goes through all of those coincidences. You're going to have to believe that it was Leo's father who found the body himself from a vision from God and all these things. And it's powerful. And I always thought, boy, it'd be really interesting to hear somebody do the reverse of that, the 12 days of Christmas, as to why, Leo was innocent. Jack Edmond didn't do that, but you guys kind of did. I thought you brought up a lot of things that really reflected that strength of that prosecutor's argument and brought it to the defense side. So I thought that was really, really interesting and really well done. And, I'll just say one other thing. I go around and I do a lot of public speaking about this. And a lot of times it's public defender's offices, but a lot of times I go into prosecution offices. And I always say this especially to the young prosecutors, like, no one's ever going to come in and write a book about a case that you stopped cold because there weren't the facts to go forward with it, because there's nothing heroic about that. That's just prosecutors doing their job, and you're preventing a miscarriage of justice before it gets off the ground. And I cannot tell you how that resonates with people. People talk to me all the time, young prosecutors coming up and saying, this stuff matters to us. We care about this stuff. And so I just always like to mention that, because sometimes I think you get pitted on, the defense attorneys, the public defenders are the heroes of every story, and the prosecutors are the bad guys from the state or using all that power. And, certainly there's cases on both sides, ineffective counsel and prosecutors engaging in misconduct, but it's not the norm. And I think it's really important to understand the prosecutorial side of this as a storyteller, and I wish more people did that.
Let me ask you this. Well, first of all, did you have an opportunity to talk to either Alice or the LaFoons?
No, the LaFoons had passed away a while ago. I did talk to Ricky Scott, who was Alice's husband, and also to Linda Sells. They were not they didn't want to be on the air. I think, it's caused some family strife and all that stuff. So they didn't really want to engage back in it. But they did both tell me that they stood by everything they said in court and to the journalists. They stood by the story. I absolutely believe that Linda Sells saw what she said she saw. It was just on a different date. This is hard for me to say because I can't really prove it, but a lot of the stuff that was happening in this case was happening in John Aguero's office, away from police. And so it doesn't make it into reports a lot, but that's where I see the most glaring evidence that all of a sudden comes into view, and it's stuff that was gained in the office. I think that there may have been a conversation between John Aguero and Linda Sells, where Linda Sells, she stuck to her story on the stand when Jack Edmond questioned her. She says, I'm not saying it was the same night. It was a week or two before Michelle disappeared. She was pretty adamant about that. I think there was probably an incident, and I can't prove it, where Aguero said, all right, just tell the story and don't say what date it is. And you can see he lets her get away with on one particular night and never follows up with it. And I think there was that kind of confusion. There's another thing that the Lafoons said, which kind of got me very suspicious. And this was another one. 15 months after Michelle is killed, they go into Aguero's office at the suggestion of Alice Scott. And it's a very brief police report. And they don't really mention the specifics that they get into in trial. But one of the things they say in the police report is, saw Leo's car on State Road 559. That's where the car was found, 7 miles away from this. That's not really in an area that they would have been delivering newspapers on. That's way out rural area. So I think that information probably came to you like you suggested, Alice. Alice Scott was the busybody telling people about the case. Oh, you got to talk to the Lafoons. I'll get Aguero, talk to the Lafoons. She set that up. And then the Lafoons go in there and tell maybe their story. I think maybe I did see Orange Mazda, but they say it in the wrong location in the police report. It's at the spot the Mazda was found, which was not helpful to the state. And so by the time she testifies, she sees that car at the dump site. And so that's changed again. And so those are the kind of things that just make me feel really suspicious. These are things that are not said to police. It's just mentioned in a summary of a police report.
Okay. Leo Sr.
Oh.
Leo Sr. has been probably the most discussed person on the gallery, on Patreon, people who are watching it. People are very suspicious of him. And I think even though Jeremy Scott seems like the guy who did it, Leo Sr. still draws a lot of suspicion, both because of his other crimes and obviously the finding of the body, the message from God, all that stuff. Your thoughts on Leo Sr.?
Yeah, I mean, there was one thing I remember thinking, like, when I started talking to Leo, one of the things is, like, if you're going to help me with this story and I'm going to take on this case, you can't mislead me, because I don't want to waste time doing that. And if you're not going to tell me the truth, then I can't trust you. And I remember thinking, like, if he misleads me, I'm kind of done with this. Like, I just don't want to play those games. I'm not going to go into a case like this. The only thing I thought of that was interesting was if I thought that Leo Sr. had some kind of involvement in this, then it becomes still, I think, an interesting story anyway, that we have Leo Schofield Jr. in prison for a murder that perhaps his father committed. And that's still a dynamic and interesting story that I would be curious to get to the bottom of. The problem with it is we just started investigating and talking to people, and there's just nothing that connects him to this murder. And there's just nothing there. There's no witnesses that saw anything like this, like a car or anything. And he's not a stealthy guy. I mean, this guy is a mess. If you read his testimony, he's a mess. He can't keep his story straight. I believe somebody like that would crack in 2 seconds if he was investigated thoroughly. And he was investigated, and the state never have found anything. I think that's probably the reason John Aguero came to Leo in prison or in jail and sort of said, I don't think you killed Michelle. I think it was your father. That's an interrogative technique to see what can happen, where it could go from that. And it's also, as you mentioned in it, at one point when Leo finds out that his father is arrested for molesting an underage person, this is up in Massachusetts. He's like sitting in jail now. And he's like, if you know anything about my father and can you please tell me? And don't tell them I asked you that, but I want to know, like, what else did you learn about my father? Because he's trying to piece it together. He became pretty convinced that his father had nothing to do with it. I talked to some of the family members, and every one of them described him in non-flattering terms, but they did say he was not a violent person, and that would have been way beyond his MO to do something like that. There's nothing in his life that ever pointed to anything physical and anything violent like that. So, we just never found anything, and I just couldn't make it work in any way.
Let me ask you this: did he ever do anything inappropriate vis-a-vis Michelle? Ever?
Not that I could find out. Leo didn't believe that he ever did. I think that would have been a real problem with Leo. I mean, Leo had one comment. I don't even know if it was in the podcast, but he goes, if I found out my father had something to do with this, you don't have to offer me immunity. I'm testifying against him. I don't care about that, So I could never find anything like that. I think he was drawn to like these molestation cases, but there was no indication that he was targeting Michelle. Never heard anything. One other thing I did hear about Michelle, which I don't even know if we did a really great job. We had a couple of witnesses and friends say it, but she was no shrinking violet. She was strong. I don't think she would have put up with something like that. The father, I think she would have told everybody about that. That's just my guess. If Leo got some kind of creepy vibe from it, I think he would have told me, and he didn't. He never said anything like that.
And I think this is the situation that it's difficult for people to separate, for example, someone who lies as not just a liar. Is someone can be an unsavory character and do really bad things and not be the murderer in this case, because molestation of underage girls is very, very bad. But it is not the same type of crime as a very violent, close combat stabbing of someone very close to you as well.
Yeah.
And you're right. Those sorts of things typically don't pop up, at least in hindsight. There's going to be some signs. And we looked at the timeline. Obviously, his alibi are his own family members who could have an interest in covering up for them. But those are alibis that have stood strong over time. They have not been demolished. And I think with the timeline, what I came to is there was no way that Leo Sr. was involved and Leo Jr. wasn't. And I'm convinced Leo Jr. is not involved.
Yeah, I came down the exact same way, because if you look at the timeline and the places that they had to be together, they would have had to have been in on it together. And that's just sort of tipped me off. That's really interesting that you bring some of those things up. I mean, these cases they're complicated. I think sometimes when you look at these, you want to see the fuzzy bunny of the wrongfully convicted. Like, he was an altar boy and he just got grabbed off the street, and the next thing you know, and it's not always like that. You're dealing with a real low income neighborhood, people who are really poor, they're struggling, they're on the poverty line. There's a lot of violence in this community. I mean, just from our own investigation, I can't tell you how many times we saw we interviewed people who were like 13 or 14 years old. They had their first kid. And so they're barely finishing high school. And you just see this cycle in this area, especially around Cumbie. And so, when you're dealing with this kind of community, you're not going to usually get the fuzzy bunny, the altar boys. Like, there's people who become suspects in crimes are sometimes usually people that are known to police. In this case, Leo wasn't. He really didn't have any run-ins with the police before this. So, he's about as fuzzy as I think you can get in this area. But, even him, you look at his past, it's not sparkling clean. And I'm really not afraid of complicated cases. I mean, I remember when I was trying to pitch this story around, it wasn't easy. You would think that if you were aware of the whole scope of this story, it might be something that would really stand out to you. But there was a lot of places we showed it to, and they're like, no, I don't think Leo's story can sustain a narrative because he's in prison the whole time. I remember thinking, you guys read any Russian novels? Because that does happen, or they're looking for to check the boxes. Like, is he a good guy? Is this it? And then you have Leo Sr., who's this, I call him a red herring. That's not a really great phrase for him, but he does sort of divert attention, and he's a suspicious character. And so he's in the story. They got to deal with him too. So I think sometimes that's why this case is really complicated, because there's a lot of segues that go off in different directions, things you need to be aware of when you're looking at the big picture.
Well, I think you did a great job of it. We've told everybody to listen to Bone Valley, and hopefully they will. We've kept you an hour, so there's two things I want to do. I want to ask you a final question, and then we have our 5-star questions, and you have to answer one of those.
Anything.
So
I'm happy to stay.
With that.
Happy
so
to.
My last question is going to be a 2-parter. Number 1, is there anything else you want to say about Bone Valley or Leo or anything? And number 2, if you have any future projects you're working on you want to talk about, feel free to share those as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say, I think you guys did a really, really great job in analyzing a not very easy case. I mean, anytime you're dealing with 2 timelines, and you really are, it's complicated. But I think you guys cut to the heart of what this case was about, and it was really what I was trying to do. I think I say this, sometimes people say, well, you're advocating for Leo's innocence, and I feel like, when I look at it, I feel like I'm actually trying to advocate for the state holding Jeremy Scott responsible for the murders he committed. So I feel like I'm coming in from that direction, really, in a way I'm not trying to prop up Leo.
You're a rightful conviction guy.
A rightful conviction, yeah. But, I think once you get into this really deep, you start recognizing, all right, 100% believe that Leo is innocent, wrongfully convicted. And so, like, if I have politicians asking for my files or asking me to testify before a clemency board, like, it sort of takes you out of that journalism realm a little bit and into this advocacy side. But, for me, I'm not changing anything. These are the facts. This is my research. Everybody's, welcome to look at it. And that's why I was so grateful that somebody like you were going to look into it. So it was somebody I knew understood the legal process. And because I think we made a fairly conservative case. There's a lot of things that, I left out of the podcast I think would have really helped Leo a lot, aside from the flywheel thing. But there's just some other things that came up. We just couldn't find a way to do it because of a lack of audio. So some parts of the trial we really wanted to go into, but it's going to be me reading back testimony, and like it doesn't work on a storytelling thing. If you have tape, sometimes maybe you can do it. So like there's a lot of areas that we sort of left out, and partially for that reason, I am going to write a book on this next and put off that other history book for another year at least, so I can write.
I'm glad to hear that, though, because there is a lot to write. But kind of wrapped up into that question, what is potentially next for Leo? A lot of us who have been listening to Bone Valley, went on the roller coaster rides of the parole hearings and the denials, and now he is preparing for another parole hearing. Is that right? Can you talk us through maybe what's next?
Yeah. So his last parole hearing, was kind of like an emotional roller coaster, because he was actually denied parole, but he was also transferred into this program. It's like a reentry program that prepares inmates who are eventually going to be paroled. And so he's been there for like 8 months now, I think. He's gone through all the programming. You heard him talk about it, like some of the things he has to do about accountability and just go through all these steps and getting a driver's license, all these things that sort of lead to it. He's going to be up for parole in March. He'll have another hearing that'll probably be scheduled for sometime in April. And I would think at this point, he's kind of glided through the program and done really well. As we sort of suspected, he ended up teaching some of the classes, because he has this reputation.
13 classes, he said? That's crazy.
I know, he's overextended himself.
Bit of an overachiever, I'd say.
Yeah, but he really does love the work. I think what he wants to do eventually is to go back into the prisons and to work and probably work somehow with this program or a similar program that's like that to present. But I think what's very likely to happen is he'll come up for parole. And I think, since he's gone through the program so well, I think he probably will get paroled, and then he'll be sent to a halfway house somewhere, probably Tampa. And I don't know how long he would stay there. And they would, again, just prepare him for eventual freedom. But, the thing is, in the eyes of the state, he's still a convicted felon. So he's still serving his sentence, basically, in a lot of ways. And he doesn't have the kind of freedom that you would think. And so there are some people who have come on board. And I'll just tell you another thing. I don't think I mentioned this to you, or you would have even known it. But one of the men who testified for Leo in the last parole hearing was Senator Jonathan Martin, who's the chairman of the Criminal Justice Committee for the state of Florida. And he listened to the podcast and reached out to Judge Scott Cupp. They started talking about it, and because they'd known each other from past. And he's a big car guy, and he mentioned the flywheel. That was the first thing he said to Judge Cupp. He says, when I heard that flywheel, I knew it was Jeremy.
Wow.
Yeah. And so he's got Jonathan Martin, who's sort of in his corner now, who's, advocating for him. So I think, he's got some really important people that really want to see justice corrected. And I will say this on behalf of the state of Florida, because I do spend a lot of time looking at these kind of cases, and sometimes it feels like I'm beating up on the state, but I really do feel like the state of Florida is able to recognize some of these gross injustices from the past, and they do actually correct them in the cases that I'm familiar with. And so I give them a lot of credit for, maintaining that, the integrity of the courts and the judicial system is important. And if you see something that you can either correct, maybe you're not going to bring people back to life or give them back their freedom if they're passed away, but you can at least correct it officially. That does make a difference, and it does improve the integrity of the courts. And so I like to credit Florida for doing that.
Well, I think that's an excellent way to end, except for the fact we have to answer a 5-star review question. And I have picked a perfect one, I think, for all of us, particularly given that this was Bone Valley we were talking about. This is from Brandy, and Brandy wants to know, what is your favorite dinosaur and why?
Oh, man, this is a killer, because I would talk about Bone Valley, and talk about all the bones that were being found. And I remember just Kelsey reminding me, like, there's no dinosaurs in Bone Valley. They're all sea creatures.
Oh my goodness.
So there are megalodons and giant sharks and all these things, but there were no dinosaurs in there in Florida, believe it or not. So, but my favorite has to be the Brontosaurus. I don't know why. Nice, peaceful, vegetative dinosaur.
Okay, that's a popular one. What about you, Alice? Do you have a favorite?
Well, Gilbert, Brett and I both have small children, so our lives are filled with dinosaurs. And I'm constantly being told how I mispronounce every dinosaur name. It's very humbling to have like a 4-year-old tell you don't know the English language, which I guess I don't. But I'd have to say right now, Ankylosaurus, because when I step on an Ankylosaurus toy, it's the one with all the spikes on its back.
Oh my God.
It emits noises that should not be heard by young children.
That's great. I have to say my daughter's favorite is Triceratops, which is always a strong choice. I'm very basic when it comes to dinosaurs. T-Rex, Tyrannosaurus Rex, always going to be my favorite. Can't beat the king, so I'm going to go with him.
He does have tiny arms, though.
Yeah. All right, Gilbert. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been amazing. Really glad we got to do this. Can't wait to see what's next for you. And hey, maybe one day we can work on a case together. That could be fun.
I would love that. I get so many ideas listening to the cases you come up with. Many of them I've never even heard of before. So I just find them fascinating.
You let us know. We are huge fans of yours, truly.
Well,
and it's so refreshing to see your different perspective as well, because we kind of bring different things to the table.
Yeah. And I thank you not only for just having me on, but I just thank you for putting in all that work to go through all those records and reading the transcripts and just caring about getting it right. I just feel like I can't thank you enough for paying this kind of attention to this case, because it's rare what you guys do, and I really do appreciate the time you spent.
Same goes for both you and Kelsey and Bone Valley. For those of you who, I don't know who out there hasn't listened to Bone Valley, but you need to run to anywhere you get podcasts and listen to all of Bone Valley. And I'm hopeful that if there's news about his parole, that you'll also update us either there or on your Twitter. Is that right?
Absolutely. You'll definitely be knowing about it. I promise you that.
Good. I hope to hear good news soon then.
Will we see you in Nashville for CrimeCon?
I hadn't committed to that, but I you never know. I loved it. I had a great time last time. I really met so many really interesting people, and it was the first time I'd ever gone before. So when is it? In the summer?
It's
in May now.
Oh, it's in May.
Nashville.
Okay, they're back.
They changed. It's a little. Yep, that's right.
Oh yeah, I think I'm not going to be able to make the May one, but I definitely hope to see you back there at another one, because I really had a great time.
Absolutely, but we'll be there. So if you're out there and you want to go to Prosecutors, 10%
there you
off.
go.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, well, this has been awesome. You guys know how to reach us. I'm not gonna go through all that stuff because we got Gilbert here. But Gilbert, you know how this goes. We gotta sign off. So you're here. You're a guest. You have to sign off as well. Next week we'll have a new case. It's close to Florida. We got to do sort of a weird one before we get into our next big one. So I've already picked it. I can't wait to see what everybody thinks. But not exactly in Florida. Close to Florida. That's gonna be my hint. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And I'm Gilbert.
And this is the Prosecutors Podcast. It'll just be 100 of our best friends who will.
That's right.
I got to tell you, I was just cracking up when I first was listening to, you guys did an interview with Jason Blair.
Yeah.
And Alice, you had like the greatest line. And I'm Brett.
If only that were a line.
I said, she's got to be kidding on that one. She's got to be.
If only I were kidding.
Yeah, that was so great. I loved when you guys did that stuff.
Thanks for laughing with me and not at me.
Oh, no, not at you at all. It's just like the total humanity. We've all done that.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined... let me try that again. See, I'm just so nervous.
Already off to a good start.
So nervous.
Already off to a good start.
Okay. Let me try that again. Okay.
PlutoTV is TV the way it should be, free. With over 300 channels, thousands of movies and TV shows costing zeros of dollars. So if you want to watch shows like Ghost, The Walking Dead, CSI, Star Trek, or The Price is Right, well, The Price is Right. It's free. Hit movies like Braveheart, Sonic the Hedgehog, Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy, or Mean Girls won't cost you a thing, because everything is free. All you have to do is download the app, which, by the way, is also free. Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.